Thank you. Elephants can stomp on people. I'm really very grateful to be here and honored. I just want to say one thing about Dr. Kekelame, is, and it relates to some of the points that I want to make, is that it takes a particular kind of person with particular kind of resources to be able to take things and also to express gratitude and thanks. So in some ways, what's really important is whatever Johanna said tells you something about Johanna, not necessarily about me. And one of the points that I actually wanted to make, that I'm sure we've all experienced, is I've often had this fantasy of getting two of my supervisees into the room, but neither of whom know who they're being supervised by, and for them to discuss their supervisor. And I think sometimes you wouldn't know that they're talking about the same person. It is such a relationship of intimacy, and it can go very right and very wrong, and I've had both kind of experiences. And I was just reminded this morning, I'm not quite sure why, of I attended a disability conference some years ago, and I turned to a colleague of mine who was there, and I said, you know what this is? This is a theatre of rage and grief. And it feels to me, and I meant it, I mean, there was just such incredibly strong feelings about exclusion, injustice, trying to change things, not being able to change things, and so on. And I think when in the supervisory relationship, in some ways, all of the feelings that all of us in this room and everybody else, all the feelings that we have about race, about difference, about injustice, unfairness, exclusion, come into this incredibly intimate relationship. And it's difficult and can be wonderful. And I mean, it's been wonderful working with Johanna and with many other people in this room, but also terrible working with some people. All of that comes in and has to be managed in the context of this incredible intimacy. I don't think it's a mistake that there are all these boundary violations in supervision and a lot of sexual harassment that happens in supervision, because it's so incredibly intense. So part of what we're trying to do is a really kind of difficult job, which is managing a whole lot of things that are really hard for us all to think and talk about in the context of this very intimate kind of relationship. And again, I'm reminded of a very lovely paper in disability studies. A woman called Sally French wrote a paper called Can You See the Rainbow? And Sally French has a severe visual impairment. So she can see a bit, but she can't see a lot. And she describes as a child being taken on walks with her very caring, anxious parents, saying, Sally, can you see the rainbow? It's so beautiful. Can you see the rainbow? And she would always say, yes, isn't it lovely? She couldn't see the rainbow. But what she was doing was managing the emotion of people who couldn't bear it, that she couldn't see the rainbow. And that's, I think, part of often what students, to some extent supervisors, but I think students are kind of put in the position of having to manage all of that in the context of supervision. I had an experience some years ago where I was supervising a PhD student who made a statement about the competence of black professionals in South Africa, saying that black people in South Africa are competent professionals. And I said, it was a black student, and I said to the student, you can't put that, you haven't collected data to show that black people are competent, you can't make that statement. And the student duly changed what they had put down. And I only realized a long time later, in the context of discussions with this person and some of the presentations that the person gave, was I was right to tell the person to change it. And it was actually for the examiners of the thesis, who happened to be black people. But why was this so difficult? And part of why this was so difficult was that it's kind of assumed that white people are competent in general, in everyday life. There's an assumption So nobody would have to write in a thesis about white professionals, they are competent, because that goes with the privilege of whiteness. And so part of what the student was doing was actually talking to how whiteness operates in the academy. It was inappropriate, it was right that the student took it out and so on, but what I was complicit in some way in telling the student not to call out whiteness in the work. And it really kind of struck me that that's part of what we're kind of dealing with, because, you know, the default position is that the clever people are the white people in the north, and so on and so forth. So some of the dilemma that I think that we face in supervision in our context there are many of them. But one of them has to do with again, I work in disability studies, so I use lots of terms from that area, but I think this is really relevant. In disability studies, there's a concept called normalcy. And what normalcy means is, there are many versions of it, but essentially, where what is assumed is that able-bodied people are normal, and that it is the job of disabled people to operate as far as possible as though they are normal. And part of what we're doing in supervising our students and inculcating them into the academy and so on, to some extent is that. It's asking people to conform and to play to a set of norms which were not established here and which are international. I think we should do this. I make no apology for doing it. I've said to students, start questioning things when you have the PhD and the international publications, because nobody will listen to you otherwise. But we are engaged in a kind of political process. I think it's really important, though, to understand that it's part of our job is to help our students to engage with all the dominant methods, all the dominant discourses. I force many of my students kicking and screaming into getting better qualifications in quantitative methods, because it's important. It's important to understand the dominant methods, but understanding that doing this, we might be changing the face of things, but we're also reproducing existing power relationships. We're doing both at the same time. I think that part of what this does, though, is that if we do this in a conscious way, realizing that we are participating in something that we didn't create, but that we're all part of, is that it enables people to be heard in a different kind of way. If I think of Dr. Kikelame, for example, and her wonderful article in International Research Methods, you all have to read her article about the tortoise. But part of what gave the article legitimacy is that she'd already shown that she could publish in epilepsy and behavior, transcultural psychiatry, and so on and so forth. She'd kind of built up a track record where this wasn't just a kind of strange curiosity from the South. This is the reflection of a serious scholar from the South. But you had to build up that kind of credibility, and I think in some ways it's a sort of a model. I mean, what we're always dealing with, and I didn't realize until somebody pointed this out to me, is we're always dealing with questions of, when you're talking about authorship, you're talking about authority. It's not the mistake that those are the same, the words have the same root. And all the struggles that we have with authority, with being in charge, with voice. I mean, I don't think we've been explicit enough. I mean, Ronelle mentioned it, but this is hugely gendered in my experience, is that women in particular, and this is regardless of race, women in particular, in my experience as somebody who supervised more people than most of you have had hot breakfasts, struggle often with voice. So people try and write like other people. And they struggle and struggle. And most academic writers are terrible writers. And so what people are trying to do is to write as badly as other people. But I think the politics of voice is very important, and helping people to understand that writing simply and clearly in your own voice is much better than trying to write like other people who use huge words and so on. And I mean, I do think that part of what worries me about decolonial and post-colonial theory and all of these sorts of things is that we inculcate ourselves into words and language which becomes accessible to a smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller group of people. So we're reproducing the very kind of elitism that we say we're rejecting. And there are ways, I mean, I think of Ronelle Carollison's inaugural lecture, there are ways of engaging with those things in such a way that you don't obfuscate, that you actually, he said using a big word, but where you make things clear and so on. But I think we are complicit in some ways in trying to reproduce in our own terms a kind of exclusivity and so on. And I mean, I've just sent something. Please, I hope the reviewers always hate me, will like it, showing how an article that a friend and I wrote, we kept changing it to get into this sort of very sort of post-colonial kind of text. I think it got worse and worse as it went on, as we just shoved in more and more big words, and our readership got smaller and smaller and smaller. I did it quite cynically, but I mean, I think we need to just sort of I have the weight of sort of expectations about me. I remember when I was collecting data for it's no longer the case, but I was collecting data for my PhD in Groote Schuur Hospital. I didn't have a PhD, and at that time the security was slightly less than it is now, but everybody just called me doctor when I walked into Groote Schuur Hospital. It's not a mistake. 5 minutes. I think this issue that I think, people from minorities having, it's been discussed today, that I think is really very hard. The kind of added burden of responsibility of people from minority, and I'm talking minority in the power sense or in the academy and so on, having to take on, to stand for a whole lot of other people, I think it's very problematic. Why should a black author have to stand for all black authors, or a woman for all women, or a disabled person for all disabled people, and so on? I think it's a burden which we see kind of there, but I think it's very problematic. And I just want to take up Ronelle's point that she mentioned about her selfishness in not being everybody's mother. If black women continue to play the black woman being everybody's mother, we're not going to change anything. If Ronelle is going to say, I'm going to mentor all of the people who are having difficulties with their supervisors because, by virtue of my race and gender, then it lets people like me completely off the hook, and it reproduces exactly what we're trying to engage with. So I think we need to just think about the categories that we're reproducing. One of the things for me, I love supervising. I've had some wonderful experience. I've had some terrible. You could have got a student of mine to tell you, the elephant who's either the elephant in the room or who stands on people and crushes and bashes, and you could have had all of that. But the thing that I love most is working with graduate students, and I think there's another issue in transition, which is, if the next generation doesn't do better than my generation, then I've failed. But there's also that issue, which is also between parents and children, especially in societies where people are changing a lot, and that's the issue of envy, of if I give things to my students, all my students get things that I didn't, they have something that I don't have. And I think it's a dynamic. I grew up as a Jewish child with many of the children of Holocaust survivors, and I saw it in those parent-child relationships where there was this excessive kind of giving, but at the same time actually stopping the children, because it was unbearable to think of how people had grown up and their kids were growing up in this kind of luxury. So I mean, the real sort of challenge for me, and for all of us, I think, in a moment of transition, is how can we sort of contribute to the future and feel part of it. I mean, I feel lucky that I do feel part of it. So thanks very much.